So this was going to be a review of just Dune Part 1, but going back and rewatching Part 1, I found myself thinking about how the two movies work together. Obviously, this is partly because the two movies together adapt one book, but my theory is that looking at them both, they're clearly also companion pieces that orbit around the different roles of Paul and Chani in terms of narrative and emotion. Broadly speaking, in Part 1, Chani gets the opening and closing lines, so gets to frame the overall context. But the story is more clearly about the journey of Paul Atreides and his choices and reactions to what happens. Part 2 gets a bit more fuzzy. I think it's more about Chani and her choices and emotional journey. The two films mirror each other. Re-watching the first part after seeing Part 2, it really struck me how differently Timothee Chalamet and Rebecca Ferguson played their characters. For example, the scene on the last evening of Atreides' control on Arrakis, we see them express fear and uncertainty around their own futures, around her pregnancy. Compare this with the scene in Part 2 where Paul shouts, "That's not hope," and the iron will his mother shows. The characters shift fundamentally over the course of the two films. Then, of course, Part 1 has the wider Atreides family, not just the father, but also the relationships and the affection that Paul clearly has for Gurney Halleck, Duncan Idaho, and Tafia Howard. Obviously, all these figures need to go, so Paul can fall under the influence of the Fremen prophecy and be viewed in those terms. The geography of Caladan at the beginning of Part 1 emphasizes the difference to Arrakis. Caladan is green and damp with grey skies, and Paul is noticeably less mature than later on. This lack of maturity, green geography, Caladan, gets taken away from him, and so does his father and the mentors he has such a good relationship with. He literally flies out into the desert, involuntarily at first, and then flying himself, taking the controls once his last mentor figure, Duncan Idaho, has left him. And then there's Chani. Paul only meets her in real life towards the end of the movie, but she appears in his unconscious dreams and his waking visions throughout. She's very closed off when they first meet, framing the fight with Jamis as an opportunity for Paul to have an honourable death. So we are seeing things from Paul's perspective throughout the movie, starting with him in his family, ending with him having a tenuous foothold in Fremen society. This is just the beginning, Chani says. This still feels like a plea to the audience as much as it's Chani talking to Paul. When Part 1 came out, honestly, it felt like a bit of a weak ending, and it only really works now that Part 2 itself has hit the landing. But my general point is, Chani gets to set and finish the narrative in Part 1, but it's clearly, emotionally, Paul's movie. It's about his journey from a young boy starting to be a man. And then Part 2 swaps these things over. We see Paul Atreides accept his role in this false prophecy. We see him become emperor and start to take the war beyond Arrakis. But emotionally for Paul in Part 2, not much happens. He resists at first and then gives in to the dark side. The emotional core of Part 2, I think, is Chani. Think about the scene where Paul first rides a sandworm. Obviously, Paul's face is covered through much of this scene. Think about how the camera doesn't focus on his face much at all, instead on his hands or his legs, but instead makes the emotional focus the reaction of the Fremen to his success, lingering on their joy, their happiness, their relief, much more than we actually see Paul riding the worm. Over the movie, we see Stilgar degenerate from a gentle but firm mentor figure into an unquestioning, critical follower. If you haven't watched them yet, I recommend the Life of Brian comparison videos that have been made. We see Gurney Halleck return and basically turn into another Stilgar, viewing Paul as the Duke rather than a human he's supposed to help. I think Gurney's opening scene in Part 1 established the tension in his role. He needs to help the boy learn to fight and prepare him to be Duke, but he needs to balance that with time to actually help the person. Maybe Gurney is so happy to have a Duke to serve, he forgets about the man behind the title. In any case, the point is that even the return of an Atreides influence, which was a source of a strong emotional support in Part 1, isn't really a positive for Paul and only serves to highlight his growing isolation as he gives in to the prophecy of the Lisan al-Gaib. Stilgar's moral decline, Gurney Halleck's moral decline, mirrors the decline of Paul himself. And what do the Fremen get? They get a prophet. They're obviously really happy about that. But who is the Fremen who knows Paul best? It's Chani. She's seen the internal struggle he's had. She's been there when he talked about his fears of falling to evil. The Fremen are hard, skeptical people who don't tolerate weakness. And Paul has shown weakness to Chani by giving in to the prophecy. And maybe he's only shown that weakness to his mother and to Chani. The other Fremen haven't seen it, so they're still happy to follow him, as much as she might still love him. Love without respect has a breaking point. So Chani choosing to walk away at the end of the movie seems like the right thing to do. She's held on to her ideals over the course of the story. And Paul, it's not that Paul's changed, of course he's changed. He's just made horrible decisions that he knows are wrong. So I think it's framed narratively as Paul's movie, but emotionally, Dune Part 2 is Chani's movie, because Paul Atreides has become distant and unknowable, just like Part 1 is framed narratively as Chani's movie, but emotionally it's Paul's, because Chani appears distant and unknowable. I'm really looking forward to Part 3. Thanks for watching.